Welcome everyone, and thank you. We are hosting this event today, which is brought to you by WWF, and we have a fantastic range of speakers and panelists for you. And we are coming to you live from here at COP26 in Glasgow. And the focus of our discussion and event today is the topic of, well, it's the vital topic, it's the one everyone's talking about here, which is keeping 1.5 degrees C alive. And we've heard it on the streets over the weekend, 100,000 people or so calling for this crucial target. And what we are doing today is sort of effectively taking stock of what the science is saying right now about that all-important goal, and then throwing forward to the year ahead, let's say, about what hopefully will come out of this COP, and take us forward in terms of the year ahead, in terms of making sure we keep that target alive. And obviously that target itself came out of the Paris Agreement, which took place 6 years ago, really, that COP. And it is an important climate goal in the fact that it is the key aspirational goal of that agreement. And everyone in this room and everyone in the COP is well, most people, I think, are trying to secure that goal and make sure that we don't tip into a dangerous level of warming and don't breach that threshold. Just to describe the format of what we're going to do today is we've got some speakers who are going to present on the science, as I said, and then we're going to transition into more of a dialogue or a discussion. And if you're using social media, I know we've got people who are watching this on YouTube, but however you're watching this today, please, join the discussion and even, send us questions either via the actual official COP26 platform or maybe using hashtags on social media such as ClimateWWF or COP26 hashtag, or even atting us via, the WWF account, or even Climate Analytics, which is CA_latest. So let's get started. And I think what we should do is we should go to actually a virtual speaker first. And we're going to go first to Dr. Carl-Friedrich Schleussner from Climate Analytics. And hopefully you can see Carl on the screen. And Carl is the head of climate science at Climate Analytics and group leader at the Humboldt University, Berlin. So I'm going to hopefully the technical side will allow us just to transition very smoothly over to Carl, and we're going to hear from Carl about the science now.
Well, thank you, Leo. I hope you can hear me okay. I see everyone nodding, so that looks great. So I'm waiting for my slides to put on the screen, but a very good afternoon also from my side here remotely. I cannot yet see my slides, so I'm not sure if they are up. If not, I can already kick us off a little bit, and I'm sure they'll be shown on the screen any second. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit of scene setting exercise to show us the science from the last IPCC special report that was published this year, a true landmark report, and the first assessment report in a series of 3 assessment reports of the IPCC 6th assessment cycle. It deals with the physical science basis, and even though we are probably in our focus on keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, need to talk a lot about the mitigation requirements to do so. As always, the physical science is at the very heart of what we are doing here at the climate conference. And there are some key elements in this report that support and supplement historic and already existing understanding on the 1.5 degree goal, and provide further perspective for us to look into this. I still cannot see my slides. I don't know if they are up in the room. Now I can see them. That's great. So I can just maybe jump to the next one, please. Okay, so I am still flying blind in terms of what I do see on the screen, but I will just keep going. So we have the key messages of the report that you should all see on your on your screen at the studio and also in the virtual app. And I think it's really summarized very well in 4 or 5 key messages that are distilled by this enormous scientific effort. So climate change is here now. We are the main cause, and the impacts are being felt worldwide. I don't think I'll need to explain that much to anyone here, but I think it's important that we have quite a few advancements in terms of the fundamentals of climate change science in this report that help us to understand both the severity of climate change, but also the effectiveness of stringent mitigation. So we can rule out catastrophic runaway global warming effects, or else we really know it is in our hands to achieve the 1.5 degree limit if stringent mitigation was to be deployed. So it reaffirms central findings on the special report of global warming on 1.5 degrees, including on key outcomes like net zero emissions and the near-term emission reductions up to 2030 that are required to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And it also showed that stringent mitigation in line with 1.5 is not just paying off sometimes towards the second half of the century, but has very concrete effects already in the very near term. So if we go to the next slide, just to give an illustration how climate change is here now. Next slide, please. You can see how we are basically experiencing climate change today that's unprecedented over centuries or thousands of years. And just a very recent update yesterday, there was a new reconstruction of the climate over the last 24,000 years by Osman et al. In Nature that actually showed how probably the IPCC's estimate on this is even conservative, and we are very clearly outside the range of historic or paleo temperatures over the last 100,000 years. We are seeing these effects around the globe. Extreme events are happening in every region and are hitting home already to date, and will continue to intensify in the future, as is shown on the next slide, where you can see 5 illustrative pathways that have been assessed by the in this IPCC report. They are not comprehensive in nature. They are illustrative, and many more pathways, including a greater focus on 1.5 degree compatible pathways, will be put also in the Working Group 3 report that is expected next year in spring. But some key findings are obviously of key relevance for this COP as well, that unless we achieve deep emission reductions in CO2 and net zero greenhouse gases, and net zero CO2 by the mid-century, and deep reductions also in other greenhouse gases, we will not manage to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And it includes one illustrative scenario that keeps 1.5 degree within reach and reaffirms the findings of the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please. We do have a wide assessment of different impacts. Also there, an ever-increasing understanding of the differences between impacts at 1.5 and 2 degrees, also including on crossing dangerous tipping points, such as of the Western Arctic or Greenland ice sheet. And limiting warming to 1.5 degrees on the long run is estimated in the report could avoid as much as 3 meters of sea level rise over coming millennia. So every fraction of a degree matters, really the mantra of the Working Group 1 report, and applies to every degree above 1.5 degrees even more. I want to close it just illustrating on my next slide the key benefits also of stringent mitigation in the near term. So emission reductions in line with 1.5 degrees would show effects within the next 20 years, and direct effects on air quality by reduced aerosol concentrations and methane emissions within years. And I want to advertise a report that we just published with the Constraint Project, where we further unpacked the findings of the IPCC AR6 report in terms of the decadal warming rate. So the IPCC said we will see significant differences in the warming rate, and we looked into this in terms of how much we would really see. And what we find is that over the next 20 years, the warming rate of a SSP 119 scenario that keeps 1.5 degrees within reach is reduced by about 40% compared to where we are currently heading. So we will have very concrete near-term benefits as well from stringent mitigation. And I think that sets the scene hopefully nicely for a great event and a good discussion. And I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carl. And next up, we're going to move straight on to Dr. Stephen Cornelius, who is the Chief Advisor on climate change at WWF here in the UK. And he works specifically on international climate change policy and science, including on what we're talking about today, the 1.5 temperature goal. And has also been, heavily involved with the recent and ongoing, actually, on IPCC report, the sixth assessment recycle. And before joining WWF, Steve worked for over a decade in the climate change negotiations for the British government and the EU. So a perfect person to discuss both the science and, as we move on, the policy response and what we do. So over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. So I'd like to build on some of the points that Carl has made and also talk a bit more about how nature can be part of the solution, how nature can be a climate hero. So first of all, human activities are warming the planet. So the blanket of greenhouse gases that have come from burning fossil fuels, so coal, oil and gas, and from the destruction of nature, so for example, cutting down forests for agriculture, that is leading to the warming of the planet. And the latest science from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, show that we are already at 1.1 degrees of warming. So, not so far away from the 1.5 degrees that we've agreed in the Paris Agreement to try and limit global warming to. And again, as Carl has shown, at this level of warming, at 1.1 degrees, we are already seeing huge impacts around the world, from severe flooding across Germany, across China. We're seeing extreme heat, particularly in Canada this year. So these things are already happening. Climate change is already with us. And what the science shows and what observations have showed, that the increase in temperature, the risks and the impacts increase as global warming increases. And so, again, Carl's point that every fraction of a degree matters is key here. So I've just chosen to have one slide, and this is basically pulling out science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a few of the reports they've done in the last few years, and looking at the difference between risks at 1.5 degrees warming and at 2 degrees warming. And you can see, Carl outlined sea level rise, but there's others, including the bleaching of coral. So at 1.5 degrees, we'll see some devastating impacts, 70% of corals being affected. But at 2 degrees, virtually all corals, warm water corals, can be wiped out. So this is huge impacts on climate on people and nature. So the science basically says 1.5 degrees is safer than 2 degrees for people and nature. Now, the negotiations that are going on at the moment here in Glasgow at COP26, there's a thing called the cover decision, and the draft that we saw yesterday, and this is being revised. At the moment, it recognises that the impacts of climate change will be much lower at a temperature increase of 1.5 compared to 2 degrees. So that's highlighting that, I think, is crucially important. Now, the IPCC makes it clear the importance of nature and natural systems in slowing the build-up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So over the last decade, the average carbon dioxide that emitted due to human activity, it's reached the highest level in human history. Of these emissions, 46% is accumulated in the atmosphere, so just under half, and the rest is absorbed by, it doesn't go into the atmosphere, or absorbed from the atmosphere. So 23% of it is taken up by the oceans. So that slows warming, but it has the effect of increasing the acidity in the ocean, which is detrimental to ocean life. And 31% is absorbed by terrestrial ecosystems, so the land, so plants and soils and the like. So, so the land, the oceans, are big allies of ours to limit global warming. Now, a takeaway message from a recent workshop report from IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the IPCC. So they did a report earlier this year, and it highlighted the need to solve the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis together, and that neither could be successfully tackled unless you did them both together. And that's because biodiversity loss and climate change are both driven by human activities, economic activities, and they mutually reinforce each other. But there is some hope here. We have WWF put out a report last week called NDCs, A Force for Nature. And that showed that 92% of the new NDCs, so an NDC is the nationally determined contribution, so that the sort of short-term climate pledges from countries under the Paris Agreement. And 92% now include nature. So, and most of these are in the context of both mitigation, so the idea of cutting emissions to limit climate change, and adaptation, so responding to the climate change that's happening. Excuse me. So many of the NDCs now include a broad, or refer to a broad range of ecosystems, including forests, agricultural lands, mangroves, wetlands, and marine ecosystems. So, so this is encouraging that countries are recognising that, as well as the deep cuts to fossil fuels, that nature can be a huge ally. And I think that the final message before I turn back to Leo is that there is no pathway to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees without nature. But nature, we need to help nature do this. We need to help protect and restore nature for this to happen. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. And before we move over to the panel, we're now going to hear actually a video message from Bill Hare, who many of you will know, but is the founder and CEO of Climate Analytics. And unfortunately, we're taking a video message. We'd love for Bill to be here, but he's actually halfway across the other side of the world and probably may even be asleep right now. Who knows? Hopefully. But Bill is a physicist and climate scientist with 30 years of experience in science, impact, and the policy response to climate change and stratospheric ozone depletion. And as I said, he's the founder and CEO of Climate Analytics, which was established to synthesize and advance scientific knowledge on climate change and provide state-of-the-art solutions to global and national climate change policies. And my work as a journalist, working, editing Carbon Brief, the website, we absorb and we pay a lot of attention to the output and the findings of Climate Analytics, who do a lot of fantastic assessments and reports into this. So I think if we can tee up the video, let's hear from Bill before we move over to the panel.
We're here today because we all know that climate change, global warming, caused principally by the emissions of carbon dioxide from burning coal, oil and gas, presents us all with existential risk, no matter where we live, unless we can curtail and stop that warming rapidly. Many of the most vulnerable countries here in Glasgow face an extremely uncertain future unless we can collectively limit warming to the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree limit. Glasgow is in fact the first critical test of the Paris Agreement's 5-yearly ambition ratchet up mechanism. And in some ways, its highest purpose is to keep open through these commitments the possibility of meeting the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree limit. In Paris, all countries agreed to submit more ambitious NDCs for 2030 by now. But we find ourselves in a situation where at least 53 countries, covering at least 57% of global greenhouse gas emissions, either did not significantly enhance the emission of their NDC, resubmitted the same NDC, or did not submit an update at all. On the present trajectory, global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 will still be around twice as high as is necessary for the 1.5 degree limit. The 2030 emissions gap has only been closed by 15 to 17% in the last year. And if we count the recent sectoral goals put forward in the last week, by only another 8%. If we're generous, let us say that we've closed the 2030 emissions gap over the last 12 months by just 25%, leaving 75% unaddressed. The projected warming from what governments are actually doing, their current policies, is still headed at a very high level, ultimately 2.7 degrees warming by 2100. And this has only moved by about 0.2 degrees Celsius in the past year. What determines how much the planet warms is how much greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere, not the nature and quality and timing of the politics, the pledges, or the announcements. Now, the latest climate action tracker update tells us the world is heading to at least 2.4 degrees of warming with the current national climate pledges. We've seen an important wave of net zero announcements and pledges before and during Glasgow. But the net zero announcements alone will not get us to 1.5 degrees. Yes, 90% of global emissions are now covered by net zero pledges or announcements. But the Climate Action Tracker's 40-country analysis shows that only a small number of these, covering only 6% of global emissions, actually have plans in place to get to net zero. The robustness of the pathway to net zero, how deep the emissions are in 2030, depends on early and strong action. The time for action is now, actually, in this decade, not in 30 years' time. So at the end of the day, it's very clear that collectively we're not doing enough. To sum it all up, governments are currently not set to meet their own targets, and those targets themselves are not compatible with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree limit. So there's a very big question now that the big emitters need to answer, and they need to come forward next year in 2022 to finish the job that's only just been started. That is to close the 2030 emissions gap by COP27. And that's why I think there needs to be a head of government meeting towards the end of next year to really nail the issue of closing that 2030 emissions gap and meeting Glasgow's purpose of keeping 1.5 degrees in sight and able to be achieved. Thank you.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much for recording that, Bill. It's a shame you couldn't be here with us in person in Glasgow, but it's wonderful to hear your thoughts on this. And we can now sort of move into the panel segment of this this event. And what we're going to do is focus on, I think, two key questions, but we're going to hear from our panelists first. And the first key question is really getting the panelists to sort of reflect on the latest assessment by the Climate Action Tracker, and which, we've seen this, as Bill was saying, this wave of net zero pledges, but also what Bill was stressing there is it's the near-term NDC commitments in this decade, which is really going to be the key thing that determines whether we can keep 1.5 degree C goal alive. So we've got three very different speakers focusing on three different areas of expertise. But I think what we're going to do first is hear from Laura Williamson, who is joining us virtually, not here in the studio. And Laura directs membership and institutional partnerships work at REN21, which is the Renewable Energy Policy Network of the 21st century. And prior to REN, Laura worked for Helio International, an international think tank developing renewable energy solutions, and also at UNEP, leading on industry and sustainability issues. So a fantastic person to approach this big first question we're looking at. So I think, is Laura on now? Yeah, I think so. Can you hear us, Laura? Fantastic. Okay, well, over to you, Laura, to sort of start off this session. Oh, maybe we have an audio problem. Maybe you still, I don't know if you're muted, Laura. Let's just check. We'll just check that. But what we can do is we can, maybe, are you definitely not muted, Laura? Or we can move on to the next panelist and give you some time just to quickly. Yeah, I think should we do that? So I think let's move on. Okay. Well, don't worry, Laura. We'll come back to you.
Actually, oh. I just got unmuted. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. I was forced to unmute.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura. Okay.
I was try sign language, but I didn't think that would work very well.
No worries. Okay. Over to you, Laura.
Great. So if someone could put back up that first slide, so building on the two presentations that we've had, I'm going to look very much sort of at where we currently stand with regards to fossil fuels. So this is just a very, I think, quite a powerful image in that we can see, we talk about the great uptake of renewable energy that we've had over the past decade. But when we overlay it on the fossil fuel consumption, we can see two things. First of all, the increase in the share of renewables, while impressive, is not impressive enough. And the second is that despite this 10-year progression, there really hasn't been any change in our consumption of fossil fuels because, of course, energy consumption has increased. So this is sort of the reality check that we need, along with the science that we've just heard, to really say, you know, there's a lot of ambition out there, but what is the reality? And we're clearly very, very far from it. You can take down the slide now. And part of that is that we really do have a very strong disconnect between how we view the energy sector. There is a lot of focus on the power sector. The power sector is very important, but it only makes up 20% of our total final energy consumption. The rest is in heating, cooling, and transport. And so we need to really also address those sectors. And so from the renewable energy side, great to laud the progress in the power sector. We definitely need the power sector. We need to see how much we can electrify, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that if we really are going to stay below 1.5, there's a whole other part of our energy consumption that we really are not focusing on with the intent and with the concentration, the rapid uptake that we really need to focus on.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And the next panelists to sort of focus on this question of kind of, before we move on to the next question, which is throwing forward to the year ahead. We're looking, you know, in the present tense, right here we are, where we are in Glasgow, is Dr. Matthew Gannon also from Climate Analytics, who is the Senior Scientific Advisor supporting the climate policy team at Climate Analytics. And Matt provides targeted support on all aspects relating to climate mitigation and advises the team on interpreting, translating, and synthesizing scientific and modeling results into policy relevant context. So, Matt, it would be great to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Leo. And I think it's a very, very timely question. I have to say, reflecting on this COP, it seems like there's been such a lot of media coverage and media blitz and information that has been really hard to sort of digest. There's been a lot of different estimations in terms of where we're headed. Very early on, the IEA came out and with a 1.8 degree pathway, which sort of set the tone for the first week. And I think what's really interesting and important about the analysis that the Climate Action Tracker has done is it's really sort of laid bare and laid out all of the different sort of pathways that we could be going along based on different sort of levels of action versus promises. So one of the things that the report that the CAT put out starts with, as Bill mentioned, is basically what direction are we headed based on real action on the ground, existing policies, et cetera, and that was at 2.7 degrees. And then it starts to look forward, looking at promises in the relatively near term, the nationally determined contributions. There, as Bill pointed out, 2.4 degrees. And then there has been this wave of net zero targets, most recently in the high-level summit here with India announcing a 2070 net zero target. And if you indeed take all of those promises very far out into the future, focusing on net zero, the CAT assessed indeed that under that kind of scenario, we get to 1.8 degrees. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about, is that a bit pie in the sky? Like, should we trust that sort of far out sort of estimation? I think it's important to ground ourselves in that these net zero targets are very important in terms of directionality, in terms of showing us where we need to be. But one of the really important things is that they need to come with specifics, right? And at the moment, only about 6% of the total net zero targets have the actual specifics that provide them credence and credibility, even though 90% of total greenhouse gas emissions today are covered by net zero targets. A small portion of them have all of the information that lets one sort of assess how important and how impactful they'll be. So I wanted to just briefly touch on what some of those aspects might be. So critically important is that a net zero target needs to cover not just CO2, but all greenhouse gases, because we know from the scientific Working Group 1 report that it's really cumulative emissions of all greenhouse gases that is what is putting warming into the atmosphere. And so we see a lot of net zero targets. Some of them only cover CO2, some of them cover all GHGs. I think
We still don't really know whether that's CO2 or GHG.
Exactly. And actually, when China earlier this year came out with its net zero target, for the longest time, the analytical community assumed that that was going to be all GHGs. And in their most recent long-term strategy, they've clarified it's CO2 only, right? And so it's this is really important in terms of when we want to calculate how much warming is embedded in that net zero target. We need to know what's the mix. I think the second thing that's really important in these long-term strategies and net zero targets is not just where they want to go, but the roadmap about how to get there. So what are the sectoral benchmarks? What are the emissions benchmarks? Where do they want to be? I mean, the NDCs will cover 2030, but what about 2040, right? If you have a net zero target based in 2060, it's a far off target, and it's really hard to estimate what the impact of that will be without knowing what's the planned trajectory to get there. Thirdly, one thing that is sort of rife in these net zero targets is an assumption about carbon removals. And so it's to properly assess and have a credible net zero target, I think there needs to be an enumeration of what you expect to do in terms of taking carbon out of the atmosphere to achieve that net zero target, be it either from sustainable forestry and land use or even technical removal solutions. And then finally, what really is important for a credible net zero target is also talking about what it means in terms of a country's equitable achievement of the Paris Agreement. And what that means for developed economies is that part of that needs to include finance outside of their borders, contributions to mitigation, not just domestically, but elsewhere. And in terms of developing countries, it's that plan. It's about saying how much finance you need and how you're gonna utilize it. And I want to finish just with a note that the net zero targets that we have now largely don't have enough detail, right, that could really be improved. But even if we had a whole raft of very credible net zero targets, which is a necessary condition to achieve the Paris Agreement, it's not still a sufficient condition, right? And that's because it's not just about where we're going in the long term, but it's really about how we get there. And what's really critical, I think, for ourselves to understand, for sort of the general public to understand, and also the negotiators in the room to understand, is that this next decade is going to make or break the Paris Agreement. If we don't get those emissions down, as Bill said, we're on track to emitting twice as much in 2030 as what's compatible with a 1.5 degree pathway. And it's that cumulative amount of emissions that add to warming. So if we don't get those emissions down by 2030 in this decade, then we're very likely to sort of run out the clock on the 1.5 degree temperature goal. So.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I mean, just reflecting on what you're hearing here in Glasgow as these talks, grind into the last few sort of days and hours. Do you think what will come out of the Glasgow conference is the kind of specificity and that tightness of detail? And we hear about the Paris Agreement's ratchet mechanism, but there's a lot of pressure to bring that even closer, not wait for these 5-year cycles, get people to get the parties and the countries to come back sooner, within a year maybe. And do you think that's vital to keep 1.5 alive, as we heard the campaigners saying over the weekend on the streets? Do we need that detail, or these? I think you're suggesting these important but long-term net zero goals are just not enough.
I think for sure net zero targets alone will not keep the Paris Agreement alive. It will not keep the 1.5 degree target alive. I also think that the urgency of the situation demands a more frequent updating in terms of targets, and whether that's under an official mechanism or whether that's a voluntary coming to the table next year. So for example, at the moment there's a plan to convene a high-level leaders summit next year to ratchet up ambition. I think that that's a great step. I think that as we talked about, of the ambition gap that's been closed this year, that only comes from 40% of the countries that are emitting, or 40% of the total greenhouse gas emitting countries. That other 60% needs to update their NDCs. And I think they need to do that next year in order to get us on the right track.
And just before we move on to the next panelist, Vanessa, do you, in terms of, like last week, for example, we saw a range of kind of very fascinating and interesting, but sort of sectoral and quite specific pledges around methane, around forests, around transport and things. As an analyst looking at adding up these summing these all up and adding them into a grand total to see what that means at the global level. Is that helpful to get that granularity and to go down, or is that actually quite confusing? And is there a bit of smoke and mirror there that we need to keep a very close eye on?
So I think that's a great question. So we tried to take a first look at this, and this is actually something that Bill was referring to in terms of that ambition gap closing by another 8% or so, because we went through and we looked at the methane pledge, we looked at the coal pledge, we looked at the transport pledge, and then also the forestry pledge. And it's non-trivial. It's relatively difficult to unpack these things. And what's really critically important about these pledges is who is including themselves, who is signing up to these pledges, because a lot of this information is already included in pledges that already exist, be they the nationally determined contributions or other pledges. So for example, the New York Deforestation Pledge from 2015. And so you really have to think and look carefully about who's being included. And at the end of the day, I think the directionality of those pledges is welcome. I mean, we need to stop using coal. We need to stop deforestation, but the whole world needs to sign up to these.
All right, brilliant. Thank you, Matt. And the next panelist we're going to hear from is Vanessa Perez Carrera, who's the Global Deputy for Climate and Energy for WWF International. And prior to this, she served as Deputy Policy Director at the Mexican Ministry of Environment. And I think crucially for this discussion as well, Vanessa is an environmental economist who is focused on international climate policy and economics. Vanessa, on this question around this kind of where we're at in the present, where the pledges and the commitments we've been hearing over the past week to 10 days, and where we're at right now in the negotiations, what's your response to that as we currently stand right now?
So honestly, Leo, I mean, I haven't seen so much movement and visibility in the climate movement globally, right? Just the paper coverage, the media it's incredible. It's actually getting to everyone, right? People, my friends, right, that are not necessarily environmentalists, all of them, which is a great sign. It's definitely a great sign. But I think the other thing that has marked this conference is certainly the idea of credibility, right? And that has been very, very strongly put across everything. And that is super important. It's super important even for the long-term pledges, but also for the short-term pledges, right? So I do think that there's a momentum, and that momentum is growing strongly. And I think that also the different actors are realizing that there are more and more actors willing to take them into account and really look at the specifics of what they're putting on the table. And actually the nature agenda comes in very usefully, I would say, even if others would think the opposite. So definitely, I mean, nature is not a distraction, right? And the call in the streets against offsets is really just pledging that there be no tricks in what the pledges that are putting in the table. So I think that we have to debunk this idea of nature as a distraction. Nature is a key ally, but it's also crucial to get to the 1.5 degree, and it can do actually more for us. It will pull us back from the brink of our web of life, but it can also tackle a lot of the other things that have been discussing here, right? If we do it rightly, we can tackle a lot of the human rights piece, the indigenous peoples and local communities. You can tackle the recovery with a focus on the poorest of the poor, because they're actually the closest to nature, right? And so I think that looking at all of what nature and its all the value on that it can give us, it is actually quite useful. So I would going back to your first question, I think I'm hopeful, but I do think that the world needs to just open their eyes in terms of the emergency, right? And I think that, just looking at 2 years back when the 1.5 degree was put so strongly on the table by NGOs, I think it just permeated across society. Now it's science which is being the benchmark for what we do, and I think that's a great achievement. But then when you think about the trillions in fossil fuel subsidies, you actually think, governments are actually not taking this seriously, right? That would be the first step of political leadership in my point of view. So I hopefully, but it's the first time I see subsidies mentioned in the text of this process, right? So I'm hopeful that they really take it seriously. They really put deadlines to sectoral deadlines, right? To deadlines on coal, deadlines on oil and gas. Oil and gas has not been discussed here very, very much, to be frank, and must be discussed. And probably an indirect way of tackling is just really thinking about all fossil fuel subsidies, right? So I hope I answered your question a bit on here and there. No.
Thanks, Vanessa. It's striking in the cover text that came out. It's such a blur now. I can't even remember when it was. 24 hours ago, or in the latest text. And as you say, it references fossil fuels, which is kind of striking. Normally that is a kind of red line term, and you don't see that mentioned at all. And I'm sure there'll be pushback against it. Let's see what happens. But intriguingly, also, I think the term nature-based solutions was actually in the text as well. Again, we don't know whether that will remain, but it's intriguing. What was your reaction to see a term like that in the cover text?
So we've been working with the nature-based solution term for over 2 years, being very, very active with the IUCN standard on nature-based solutions, and I think that the term has a lot of power, because if you look at the IUCN standard, it's actually nature-based solutions to key global challenges, so right?
Just for our audience, just briefly describe what we mean by nature-based solutions. It maybe sounds obvious, but it would be good to know in this context in Glasgow why that term would end up in a text like this and a draft text, and what it actually means.
Sure, definitely, Leo. So basically means to protect, manage, or restore natural ecosystems to tackle specific societal challenges. So those societal challenges are climate mitigation, climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction, food security, and water security. So it is not just including, that there's millions of ecosystem services that nature provides, but it's really focusing on these very 5 specific societal challenges and recognizing that nature has the power to tackle these societal challenges. So normally the term nature-based solutions is useful because when you think about nature-based solutions for climate mitigation, you actually are getting, if you do it right with the standards, and it must be community-based, it must be community-led, et cetera, you're actually tackling a lot of the other challenges in tandem. So you're tapping into the SDGs agenda. So very intentionally, we've been lobbying for the past year to include the term nature-based solutions, because it's actually resonating, and it's being picked up by governments as also a social development mechanism, which I think it's exactly what we want to do. So we were happy to see the nature-based solutions specific term included there, because it comes with the baggage. It comes with a positive baggage. It comes with standards. It comes when we talk about credibility. So it's not just nature in its whole. It's a term that is connected to specific definition, to specific standards that we have been aligning with other actors. No? And I'm just going to say, but of course it needs its operationalization. So just recognizing that it exists is not enough. We must have a decision by parties that mandate something, that operationalize or mandate the parties to do something with it. No.
Are you concerned at WWF that the concept and the term nature-based solutions is maybe a ticket for some actors to keep on burning fossil fuels, because they'll say, but we're absorbing emissions with, afforestation, or, we're protecting nature, and therefore it's going to allow, it's a kind of, it gives them a bit of a ticket to carry on burning fossil fuels. How do you guard against that? Because you need everything. You need to get off fossil fuel addiction, but you also need to restore and promote and to sort of nurture nature as best you can as a climate solution.
Oh, thank you for the question, Leo, and very, very relevant for the conversations these days. No, so if you think about, and of course, this conflation of nature-based solutions with offsets and all this rest is not useful at all, right? I think we have gotten into a place within this community in which we have standards for credibility on a number of things that would prevent from that happening. But so I have to say it has been done in the past, definitely. It has been abused. Not the term nature-based solutions, but just the use of nature to instead of doing what you need to do. So what we need to do is to move towards a contribution model. And what I mean when I think about a contribution model is now we have we have clarity on all of the sectoral trajectories that you need to get to 1.5. So that has been done by SBTi. The oil and gas sector does not have a trajectory because it has to transform. It has to move to another sector, right? But we have all those trajectories, right? So we definitely know that that deep decarbonization and achieving those trajectories, it's not easy. And it must be done first, so that's a mitigation hierarchy. You must avoid, then you must reduce deeply, and then, of course, if you think about, there's all of these other emissions that will be below your curve anyway, right? So what do you do with those emissions? And what we're proposing is, instead of going directly to credits, you actually account for those emissions, you budget them into a real good social price of carbon, and then you see what's your best alternative to invest in R&D within your organization or your corporate sector, to do deeper decarbonization, to propose a policy, or to actually buy high-quality carbon credits, or just to contribute to an insetting model to give the money towards a certain project and without buying credits. So you have an amount of options that you can do, because that's, in a way, I mean, to be clear, that's a polluter pays. It's actually, it's actually the curve that all of those emissions are anyway going to be released to the atmosphere, right? So you can account for them, and you can use nature to account for them and be an additional source of finance. No?
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Let's return back to Laura, who's joining us virtually, because on this question of how we move off fossil fuels as fast as possible to sort of keep this 1.5 degree alive. Sort of the mantra, the goal that we keep hearing. Laura, what is the role of renewables in that transition off fossil fuels? We hear about this a lot, but can you just explain a bit more about what that transition, that journey means? I mean, you showed that great slide before showing, the percentage increase of renewables globally is increasing, but the actual the demand of energy has grown, so proportionally it's still challenging. Do you want to just express your thoughts on this vital transition?
Thanks, Leo. And actually, it feeds very well from what Vanessa was saying when she was talking about deep carbonization, because we need to address this issue head on. And so it's great to hear, to see that the fossil fuel subsidy issue is finally, the elephant in the room has finally been revealed and really put on the table as needing to be dealt with. But it also needs to be paired. So part of it is keeping the fossil fuels in the ground, which means phasing out of subsidies. But we also need to complement it. We need to complement it with energy savings so that we're changing how we consume, energy efficiency, and then building on top of that the renewable energy. So it's not a simple sort of, either or. We need both sets of action, keeping it in the ground, but then also putting in place the energy system that we need to have a productive, thriving, innovative, society. I think we also have to be really honest with ourselves about the changes that this will incur and the losses. I mean, if I had my way, I would ban the saying win-win. People might call me a bit cynical, but for me, it's not. The problem with the phrase win-win is it has a really good intent behind it, but there are always going to be losses. But what we need to do is we really need to find out, how do we minimize this? How do we find the points of commonality and use those as the starting point for moving forward? We need to have a conversation, asking those hard questions, ensuring that transition is inclusive. And this gets back to sort of the nature-based solutions as well that Vanessa was talking about it's not about one answer, one solution fits all, but really starting from the point of what is it that we need, what is it that we want, and how can we maybe backcast from that, how we can get there. But I mean, it's clear based on the two presentations that started and what everybody has been saying up until this point, and of course the focus of the negotiations is that we need to transition to an energy efficient and a renewable energy based system. And we have to make sure, though, that it happens across all of the societal and economic activities. We can't just have it in one area or in another. And I think it was the first speaker who touched on the whole issue of the financing, right? Economic recovery packages post-COVID were 6 times higher for fossil fuel related activities than they were renewables. So, Build Back Better, it was blip shit or bullshit. Maybe I shouldn't be swearing on a COP panel, but I think where we're also not really holding the investment community and the public finance community to their task. Public finance is continuing to finance fossil fuels at $63 billion per year. That's 2.5 times higher than what's being put in to renewables. So we may have great ambition. The fact that we've put fossil fuel subsidies on the table in Glasgow is fantastic. But now we have to be really honest with ourselves. How are we going to move from that ambition into action? And I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you, Laura. Just before we move on to the second question, which is sort of throwing it beyond COP26 and looking at the year ahead of ourselves, we've actually had a really great question come in virtually, which has just been sent in by Professor Piers Forster, who I'm sure many of the panelists will know from the Precy Centre at University of Leeds here in the UK, and obviously very well-known IPCC scientist. And actually, I think this might be a question for Steve, actually. I'm going to throw this one down at you, Steve, from Piers, which is, Piers is asking, is it 1.5 degrees C at all costs? If 1.5 degrees C involves huge land use change with the resulting damage to biodiversity, is that too much in terms of a balance? Is it better to get as far as we can without, he's saying BECCS, which is bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, what some people describe as kind of negative emissions, the idea that you can actually draw down and suck CO2 out of the atmosphere using huge bioenergy and biomass growth at vast scale. Can we do it without that kind of technology and relying on that, which could have huge implications, not just for nature, but for people around the planet? Even if we miss the 1.5 degree goal and say, what he's asking 1.7 degrees, say, I mean, what do you think about that, Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Leah, and thanks for the question, Piers. So I think that, the impacts on nature and on people, it's clear that they increase, and the risks increase with temperature. And so, we did some analysis a while back that showed that, the highest impacts on people and nature were at high temperatures, and then the next highest is if you limit to 1.5, but you do it badly. And so this is, if you have huge land use change, for example, using BECCS. And so, you've got this idea of a triple challenge. So, stopping climate change, halting and reversing biodiversity loss, and being able to have sustainable development for people. And so you need to think about the response and do it in a way that that minimises all those impacts. And I agree with Laura. There's win-win is difficult, but win-win-win is even more difficult. So these trying to hit the sort of climate, people, and nature targets is going to be challenging.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Well, let's look ahead now to the second key question of this panel, which is, if we all take stock of what's going on here in Glasgow, and we don't yet know the outcome, but what do you think that we need to see happen kind of after COP26 in all your various areas of expertise to keep 1.5 degree goal alive? Let's return to Laura first, who is joining us virtually. Laura, what in terms of what we need to see after COP, and we don't, as I said, we don't know the outcome yet. What do you really need to see in the next year ahead to keep this goal alive? Oh, I think we need to unmute you, or yeah.
Nope, I managed myself.
Brilliant.
Excuse me, that was my fault. The running word of, obviously still going to be the running word in 2022, you're on mute. I think we have to be really serious about moving from ambition to action. And it's not about, I mean, pledges are important. Having an end perspective is very important, but we also need to measure the progress. And I think it's very easy. We all want to do good. We have societal pressures that ask us to behave, but in reality, it's very difficult. And I think what we need to put in place is some kind of system that allows us to measure that progress, and it needs to be something that's really simple. And so one of the things that we've been talking about, both within the renewable energy community, but also outside, really looking at, the end users and really supporting them in how do they grapple, with this shift, is that we measure it with a very simple key performance indicator, a KPI, which is the share of renewable energy. So if you incorporate that, the share of renewable energy as it applies to production processes, as it applies to whatever socioeconomic activity that is happening, you're able to then see how is that evolution, how is that movement towards that ambition actually happening. It also does another thing. If we have a really simple key performance indicator like the share of renewable energy, we're also not opening up to varying discussions. We've heard about net zero carbon, zero carbon. And there's a whole discourse now that's happening around that terminology, which allows for some very interesting what would you call them, descriptions or justifications. And I think that if we're to keep this momentum, and if we're really going to move forward and take this momentum of the fossil fuel subsidies, keeping it front and center, we also have to be incredibly pragmatic in order to keep the eye on that ambition, but also in a way that it keeps us honest in that progression towards that goal. And we're seeing these changes happen. I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen the UNDP's latest campaign, which is "Don't Choose Extinction," which is a fantastic. Basically, it's this Tyrannosaurus Rex who's saying, we couldn't avoid it. What are you doing? You can avoid it. And so what we've done is we've complemented it with the hashtag "Do Choose Renewables." And so it's this kind of conversation and these measurable key performance indicators that, from our perspective, is really a way to keep things on track and to keep us all honest, including those of us in the renewable energy sector, about the progress that we're making. And I'll stop here.
Oh, many thanks, Laura. Let's see if we can go back to Carl, who presented at the beginning of this event, because I think Carl's obviously got some thoughts on this too. Carl, can we get back to Carl? I can see Carl.
Yeah,
great.
See.
Hi, Carl.
Excellent. Very good. Yeah, great question. I just wanted to before I come to you, I want to say 2 sentences about the question that Piers has posed, because I think it's also an important one to think about our perspective throughout the full century, and our best chance to not needing to rely on carbon dioxide removal technologies or to minimize the scale to a sustainable way is to bring emissions down in this decade. Because the reason why they show in some of the mitigation pathways is because emissions in the near term are not decreasing fast enough, and therefore it needs to be made up through a carbon debt later in the century. So it links very well, I think, back to the discussion that we have had before, and this brings me to the point of, I think, what's going to happen after COP26. I think what is really key, and I hope to see that coming out of this conference, and I'm kind of still optimistic that we'll see momentum towards, is that the window of increasing ambition in this decade will be kept open. Question what the COP's going to do in that regard, or what the signal's going to be. Will it be a COP of delay, a la like climate change is the most important thing we need to deal with, so let's wait 10 years before we get serious, or is it a COP of determination and determined action and determination of climate action? And one aspect in that regard, which I think is very important, is that for the longest time on climate change, and in particular now the physical climate scientists speaking, we've been warning about impacts that are going to happen in the future. And what we see, and this year has drastically shown around the globe, is that climate change is very much here and upon us now, and no one is really safe from its impacts. And I think this will also create an ongoing pressure for governments to increase ambition to the highest possible level. And I think if they don't live up to that here in Glasgow, to actually allow them to strengthen their actions and to globally come together to move towards a 1.5 degree, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, I think they'll face ever increasing pressure by their own population. And I think that's a momentum that is building, not just because the people are basically demanding action, or the children are demanding action in the future, but because basically the climate system itself is showing us what it has in store for us, and we will probably get ever more the impression that urgent climate action is in order, and I hope we can achieve that this decade. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you, Carl. Matt, kind of looking ahead to the next year, it sounds like we're all going to be, or many of us are going to be in Egypt this time next year, perhaps, at COP27. That is sometimes a little bit depressing to think about that. We're rolling on to the next set of talks, but we're just in the middle of these talks. What do you think really needs to happen in those 12 months before the next big Egypt meeting to keep 1.5 alive? And we've had this great question from Piers, which obviously Carl has just responded to, as well as Steve, this idea that maybe we drill into that target a bit more. What do we mean by 1.5? Is it crucial, or is there too many trade-offs? If we are going to be too reliant on certain forms of negative emissions, which most of the modelling shows that you do have to have a pretty big percentage of negative emissions to get you there. What do you need to see, from your point of view, over the next 12 months?
Sure. So thanks, Leo, for the question. Let me unpack that just a little bit. So I think first thing, just to speak a little bit about what we've talked about in terms here of negative emissions, I think it is really critical to understand that in the modeling that's been assessed by the IPCC, the large amount of negative emissions that exist in some of the models isn't to get us to net zero, it's to take away the warming that was there on the way, right? And we also see a large number of pathways that get us to net zero without that. So I think here we have to be careful about thinking about whether this is necessary or whether it's a modeling artifact that just comes out of the fact that there was some overshoot and then the models are bringing it back down.
The overshoot, to be clear, you mean if the goal is to keep global warming from pre-industrial period at 1.5 degrees C by the end of this century, we may actually go to like 1.7, 1.8, and then bend back down. What you mean by overshoot, right? So you use a technology like a negative emissions to actually so you overshoot that goal, but you actually then draw it back down, and that obviously has a whole range of ramifications potentially.
That's exactly correct in terms of what these models are doing, and I think what's really critical to understand is that these models do not consider the climate impacts that happen at these temperature levels. So they're purely looking at the energy economy system. They're not looking at the climate impact system. But in terms of what we're looking for in the next year, I think really critically, so prior to this COP, we had the IPCC's Working Group 1 report. In the next year, we're going to get Working Group 2 and Working Group 3. So we're going to have a whole new set of assessed scenarios that look at different ways, different transition pathways to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. So I'm looking at COP27 to acknowledge those reports, to take those reports head on in terms of what they're telling us, in terms of the updated transition pathways. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that, frankly, we had a lot of decisions in COP25 that weren't complete. So a lot of the work of COP26 was finishing up those decisions, and that was largely sort of bureaucratic and technical, whether that's transparency, whether that's the rules of the road, the so-called Paris rulebook. So what I'm really looking forward to in terms of what happens in the next year is a refocusing on ambition. Right? But also, we can't do that in isolation because we have to think about what we're doing on the ambition front, but also what we're doing on other fronts, most importantly, adaptation and finance. And so I think a successful amount of time between now and the next COP will deal with a lot of these thorny questions in terms of ratcheting up ambition, but also how the developed world comes to the table in Egypt, having met their $100 billion finance goal, right? We talked a lot about credibility already in this discussion. I think we lost credibility from day one because we didn't come to the table with the developed countries saying, we've met the 100 billion, right? And I think it's also really important to focus on the fact that 100 billion isn't enough, right? This is supposed to be just the first step. So very recently, the UN Adaptation Gap Report came out and said by 2030, we actually need 300 billion on the table just for adaptation. Right, so this is the first step in terms of how the world as a whole equitably meets the Paris Agreement. It's not just mitigation, which needs to happen everywhere. It's not just sustainable forestry and sustainable land use, but it's also financing, both for mitigation in the global south, but also for dealing with adaptation issues of the climate change that Carl and others have mentioned is already here.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Vanessa, as Matt was saying, we've got some key moments coming up in terms of the next stages of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, arguably crucially the Working Group 2, one on the impacts around the world, both for humans and in nature and habitats, etc. Then we've obviously got the vital question of Working Group 3, which looks at the kind of the economics of responding to climate change. And we're obviously coming out, or we're hopefully coming out of, but right around the world, many communities and nations are still very, very much dealing with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And we keep hearing this mantra about, build back better and build back greener and things. In the next 12 months, as we move towards the next session in Egypt, what do you think is likely in terms of the economics, maybe even some of the politics that we're going to have in another midterm election in the US, for example? There's going to be other key elections, the new German government and how that influences the EU, and all these kind of, this big soup of issues that are going to be flowing around in the next 12 months. What's your perspective on what really needs to happen in the next 12 months to keep 1.5 alive?
Thank you, Leo, and a big question, certainly. So I think that one of the most impactful things that can happen is really that climate is starting to be embedded within not only financial risks, but also starting to permeate on financial regulation in countries. And many of the economic models that are out there do not include these assumptions and considerations. So there's a big shift in thinking about how these models and the assumptions of these models and the feedbacks of these models should be changed. So I think one is really thinking about the economic system through different lenses. And of course, everybody's talking about the reset and all the rest. But the first thing we need to do is that looking at how our economies work now, if we actually include all the IPCC and IP-based assumptions there, what would the impact be, right? And some of the things, I mean, it admires me to think about, we made a study that nature-based solutions could create 20 times more jobs than gray infrastructure or fossil fuel investments. But that is still happening, even if it's against the what we would think is the interest of politicians. So I think that breaking these clientelism models and really using the power of the people to break those clientelism models, because it actually doesn't make sense economically anymore. It is quite clear. And then bringing that to the political front and the political utility. So really looking at the constituencies of policymakers and making sure that they have that clear, and if they're not going to deliver if they don't deliver on this. Two things that need to happen would be great to have the nature-based solution text here not be removed and operationalized. But the other thing that I think it would be really, really important is that SBTi, as the standard setter for the private sector, becomes the go-to place, and it actually is mainstream within the private sector. And I think us as voters and as consumers is not putting the responsibility on us, but it's actually demanding what we need to see from corporates and what we need to see from our governments. So I think that those are some of the most powerful issues that I see. I think all of these portfolio alignment initiatives that are out there, it's still a bit confusing. But actually including these type of criteria within those portfolios will actually trickle down and start to make an impact. So we just need to make sure that we mainstream it, and we keep the different actors accountable for what they need to do with specifics, with credibility, with specific policies. That's why I think it's so important the subsidies bit, but in the very short term, right? Because those are the things that will actually make a difference in the street to the people, that governments are taking this seriously,
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. We've got just a few more minutes left. It would be nice to just be able to have the chance to bring in Steve and Carl, because we've got them both still available. Steve, there's a specific question which is, I think, interesting, in that we've got COP26 here in Glasgow and the UNFCCC process, which is specifically looking at climate change. But we've also got, it feels a bit like the little sister, but we've also got the very important Kunming COP that's taking place. It's already I think formally up and running, but it's actually the main session is, I think, in March of next year, looking at basically the biodiversity COP. How can that COP also help with the 1.5 degree goal? Is there anything that can happen in that process if we're looking for the next 12 months ahead as we move towards the Egypt COP? Is there anything in that kind of parallel and I guess interweaving process to some degree? Is there anything that we should look out for that you would actually like to see happen in that process? Yeah,
that's a great question. And one of the things that WWF has been pushing for, and Manuel Pogovidar has been pushing for, is like, how do you get these UN conventions or the Rio conventions to talk to each other better? So I mentioned earlier that that climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin and need to be tackled together. And so having the climate convention, looking at deep emissions cuts, and the biodiversity convention looking at how do you sort of protect nature essentially. They need to talk together. They need to talk to each other. So the scientific community, I think, is starting to do that. It's getting the political community doing the same.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And then finally, before we just all sign off, Carl, for you personally, what do you want to see in the next year ahead happen in respect to keeping this process here in Glasgow, speaking to the Egypt meeting and making sure that we have the right tools in this kind of policy landscape that is being sort of carved out here to keep 1.5 alive?
Yeah, I think it is really about keeping the window open to increase ambition in this decade. I think if this was signed off here at COP26 and there was an opportunity to revisit NDCs in 2030, this would be very much a lost opportunity and would put the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement at very, very high risk. So in order to deliver an outcome to be this kind of this COP for a decade of action, it needs to start in 2022 to call on countries, and we've seen some of this text coming forward. It's going to be interesting to see how it's going to survive or how it's going to read at the final text that we hope to see before us, to increase their ambition, to revisit their NDCs, to come forward with new and updated NDCs, and also revisit countries that have come forward with new NDCs, revisit the level of ambition and tend to increase it. And it's very clear that this needs to be a part of the package. So mitigation here is just one element, and it's very, very important to highlight the importance of provision of climate finance. And if I'm allowed to say that, it's also, if you look at the sums of COVID recovery packages, and we've done analysis on the amount of money that's required to get us on the 1.5 degree trajectory in the next 5 years, and the global sum of COVID recovery packages, and it's just basically just about 14% what we would need to invest in the energy to get the energy sector on track for 1.5 degrees of what we've seen coming forward of global recovery packages in the response to the COVID pandemic. And I think we kind of need to make sure that this money is channeled. We need to see how this trajectory of a really grey recovery that we're currently very much seeing out of the COVID pandemic can be stopped and hopefully redirected. And we need to have momentum around those things in next year to kind of meet and come again and revisit the 2030 NDCs. That's the key and single most important element. I think that this COP now also at this final status needs to be evaluated against whether or not this window is being kept open, and it's not the end of a 5-year cycle, and then we look forward to in 5 years to talk again, but it is more basically a call to action.
All right. Thank you so much, Carl. And we've kind of run out of time, sadly, but just to say many, many thanks to all the panelists and speakers today, and obviously both to WWF and Climate Analytics for co-hosting this event. And just very, very quickly before we go, just to say to look out for WWF's closing press conference, which takes place tomorrow at 11 a.m. UK time in the UNFCCC press room. But just, yeah, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us.